Wargaming systems or board gaming systems, and more the lines between the two are becoming more and more blurred. But a wargaming system that was either ahead of its time by a number of years or just was so completely different outside the norm, it never really took off. And you're kind of thinking to yourself, maybe playing this system or exploring it, this is a really interesting idea. This is really something unique and different. I wonder why it didn't take off more. That's the question I want to explore in this Wargaming vlog. So, Disc Wars. If I say Disc Wars, what does that kind of conjure up with that? I love wargaming systems. I love big, massive battles. And the bigger the battle, the better. That's why with Warhammer 40,000, with Battletech, I love getting together with multiple players, and we each put down tons and tons of miniatures and armies and just coordinate. That was one of the reasons why back in the day, X-Wing Miniatures was so fun to play, because at the club, at the gaming group, we would throw down 4 or 5 baby Star Destroyers. We'd throw down, here's 30 Y-Wings getting ready for their attack run. I mean, it was just everyone bringing 10, 20, 30 ships and, of course, controlling them, playing it real time. Most of the time, we never finished the game hours in, but we had a lot of fun playing it. So there's this idea of the bigger, the better. And, of course, a war game could be smaller, could be compact. The first 2 war games that I jumped into back in the day, I was originally playing D&D. We would use miniatures to paint for our dungeons and stuff. And a friend of mine pulled me into historical wargaming. From there, I really didn't collect historicals, some basically Napoleonics and Romans. Playing that, I would play. But that kind of opened me up to other wargaming systems out there. And I jumped into Ogre, of course, and Web and Starship. I played the heck out of Web and Starship. I've still got my notes on graph paper for various strategies and stuff. And I have to say, Web and Starship was 3, obviously, Terran human versus 2 alien races. It was kind of an war game economic development. I don't want to say TI Light, Twilight Imperium Light, because that's not fair to Web and Starship. But it was kind of a unique war game in that 3 players could play it, right? A lot of those initial board game, war game systems were 1 player versus 1 player. And it was a great way just to bring something out and play. Web and Starship allowed you to play 3 players facing each other. You could do one-on-one too. But also the solar map and the map you played on was based on real star systems and real light year distances. So it was kind of interesting to play that. I do have to say that when we play Twilight Imperium every couple of months, that I think really, I don't want to say prepared me for TI, but really jump-started jumping into TI based on, you don't always fight. Sometimes you work on development. Sometimes you wait. Sometimes you don't know the right. There's times in a war game system where you're playing, especially if it's multiple players. Like I do this all the time with Game of Thrones. I know what I'd like to do, but I'm not sure if that's quite the right move to make. So I don't want to get into analysis paralysis where I'm thinking back and forth. What should I do? How is this going to work? Do I make this move? And, the other player's like, Fritz, make your turn. Do something. I don't want to be a table hog with time. But there are times when Web and Starship taught me where if I don't know what quite to do, let me just position myself for opportunity, build up some resources, and just wait 2 or 3 turns. Let's see what the other players do and make a mistake or an opportunity or an alliance. So that really grew me into that. But what was interesting was these board games were very, very compact. So when I say a wargaming system, I think many of us think of miniatures and dice and big tables and terrain. That's really fantastic. And that's how I think the majority of us play war games. But then there's times where something smaller, lighter, faster, less lift would be kind of cool to play. But I don't want to sacrifice the the choices. I don't want to sacrifice the rules. I still want to get that wargaming experience is what I'm talking about. It's kind of like Zombicide Modern, Zombicide Black Plague. I love Zombicide. It does what it does very well. I always wanted to try and get that little travel set. I don't know how many were produced or if it's even optimal to play. It might be even impossible to play. But I'm like, that would be pretty cool to have like Zombicide that could fit in that super-sized small travel set. It's still Zombicide. I don't even know how big the cards are, like the size of your thumbnail. But that type of thing where it's like, let's take a war game and shrink it down from that. So Disc Wars. This was put out by Fantasy Flight Games. Before it, I'm not quite sure about the IP, who owned it. It was kind of generic kind of old school fantasy combat. But the Disc War rules were reskinned back in the day for Warhammer Fantasy Battles. And this was the time period, that brief time period, where Fantasy Flight did the rules, but they licensed all of Games Workshop's stuff. So you had Warhammer Quest, the card game. You had Disc Wars. You had Relic. You had a bunch of 40K type board games. All very well done. All very well done, in my opinion. Disc Wars was interesting because it was Warhammer Fantasy Battle in this compact form. And if you're familiar with Warhammer Fantasy Battles, not Age of Sigmar, but the old school Fantasy Battles, this is where miniatures were 1-to-1. So if you had like a giant dragon, that was a dragon. If you had a block or a regiment of, dwarf shield breakers, there were 60 miniatures there. If you had other miniatures, I played a goblin army, so that stand of 80, 100 goblins was 80 or 100 goblins. And Warhammer Fantasy looked amazing to play, but the build, the paint up, the logistics, the setup, maneuvering was fun, but then we crash and I got to count ranks, and then I got to see how many are killed, then I pull off from the back rank and we see this and that. Then I tried to cast, here we go, and my shaman's head exploded. And because I'm playing for the lulz, I've got all goblins. I've got no orcs or greenskins in there, so everyone panics. I'm starting to run. It's just absolutely crazy. Doom Diver Catapult ain't working because they can't get it fixed. I keep on rolling ones. It's like, that's part of the army. But there's a lot of bookkeeping and logistics in there. Disc Wars was interesting in that it was a literal disc that had the stats, and it had the great old school Warhammer Fantasy artwork on it, and that represented the regiment. So you'd have your discs, and some discs were bigger, some were smaller, depending on if it was a hero, a regiment, a war machine. And you had, with the expansions, you had Chaos, you had Dwarfs, you had Empire, you had Elves, you had absolutely everything in there, and you could literally build your own army to play. So you had these different discs that represented your army. How they moved was, this was the interesting innovation. How they moved was literally flipping the disc over on itself. So a faster unit or a bigger unit, obviously just doing some higher math for myself here, flipping the disc, the bigger the disc, the more that it's going to travel. So if I move, maybe I get 2 flips, 1, 2. And you would advance your units, you would move them by flipping. And you didn't have to necessarily flip forward. You could flip to the side. You could flip to the side forward. You had this whole radius with how they moved. When a disc overlapped another disc, that initiated combat. So your charge range was obviously, if I was a bigger disc, then I could cover and possibly charge you before you could charge me. So we had to kind of look at that to some effect. But it was very interesting. You flip your discs. If my disc overlaps your disc, then combat is initiated, and there's stats and there's dice rolling. Projectile weapons, archers, siege weapons had a kind of a little ruler, cardboard ruler that you would check to range and roll dice. There was also terrain included. Now the terrain was 2D. Artwork was really good, like a ruined castle, a forest, and you'd put out a few of those and set it up. And it played on a very compact space. We had a blast playing Disc Wars in that it was a full kind of mass scale combat war game that everything you could see and identify, and it wasn't miniature based, it's 2D, but the artwork really pulls you in. It played fast. You got your fix. Tabletop space was absolutely minimal. It never really took off. It never really went anywhere from that. And I have to wonder if that had to do, now, of course, this is a number of years back when GW was supporting Warhammer Fantasy. This is pre-Age of Sigmar, before they nuked everything. So I wondered if part of it was like, look, I'm into Warhammer Fantasy. If I'm playing Warhammer Fantasy, I'm playing with my miniatures and all my stuff. I'm not flipping discs and getting into that. I would counter and say that I love playing Space Hulk, which is a Warhammer 40,000 board game. I love playing Warhammer 40,000, Necrons, Eldar, Grey Knights. There are times where I'm playing 40K and I want to get like a 40K fix, but more of a board game scenario or something different. So I pull out Space Hulk and we'll play that. So I see the two go hand in hand, where if I was really into Warhammer Fantasy, really into the old world and those battles, maybe I want to just do Disc Wars for something a little bit different. But then also I wonder if just the people that were into board games, into that type of gaming, the audience for Fantasy Flight is not mass scale combat games. So perhaps they missed out on that. Perhaps the idea of physically flipping discs to initiate combat and maneuvering, perhaps that is a little bit too much. On a side note, I have a buddy where he's got Flick Car. It's like these wooden tracks, and you have these little discs with a car symbol on it, and you just basically kind of flick them on the track, and you can flick other cars off and jump over cars. As long as you're on the track, you're good, and you race around the track. It's fun to play. It's kind of unique, and the tracks can be built very, very big, but it's something vastly different, because you're like, wait, I'm not rolling dice. I'm not flipping cards. I'm like physically trying to flick my car over. Like, it's a concept that I think is outside of board games, but it plays as a board game. So did Disc Wars have something like that? But I think it's very innovative, and I think it's just a shame that when GW pulled the licensing, that was the end of Disc Wars. And I'm sure it's still out there in secondary markets. We still play it once in a while, but that's an example of, I think, a wargaming system that was a little bit ahead of its time, or a little bit too different. And even though the rules were fantastic and the IP was known, it just didn't have that traction. So turning it over to you, my fellow wargaming enthusiasts, anybody out there play Disc Wars? You're like, Fritz, I've got all of them. I've got the setup. I've got the print and play. I've got the homebrew. I've got everything, brother. Like, that would be awesome. I'd love to see that setup. But are there other systems out there that just, they didn't quite take off for whatever reason? And this ties into the vlog that I pushed up yesterday, where, as wargamers and as miniature gamers, we're always looking for new systems. I'm always looking to grow my collection. I'm always looking to establish new things if they've got bite, if they've got promise. But there's a little bit of hesitation when you jump into a new system, especially if the rules are a little bit different, or it incorporates some radically new adjustments that maybe we're not quite there yet for to go mainstream. Is it better to wait or jump in?